Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss Gaza in this policy lab. My name is Noor Arafe, and I will be facilitating the policy lab today. So world attention has somewhat refocused on Gaza since the 30th of March 2018, when Palestinians in Gaza began their Great March of Return, calling for the right return to the land from which their families were forced to flee in 1948, and also calling for an end to the 12 years of blockade that international human rights organizations have described as a crime against humanity. For years, Palestinians and the international community have decried the disastrous conditions in Gaza. We keep hearing condemnations of the 3 wars committed by Israel that have killed more than 4,000 men, women, and children. We read UN reports warning that Gaza will be unlivable by 2020, although by most standards, Gaza has been for long uninhabitable with the destruction of infrastructure and the paralyzed agricultural, commercial, industrial, health, and educational sectors. And more recently, in March 2019, a UN report was presented in Geneva and found that, and I'm quoting, Israeli soldiers committed violations of international human rights during the Great March of Return. And yet, these different reports by the UN and other international organizations on Gaza have failed to send global shockwaves, since nothing has changed on the ground and conditions in Gaza are only getting worse. So what has prevented real change from happening on the ground? And what ramifications has this had on Palestinians in Gaza and the broader struggle for Palestinian liberation? To discuss these questions, we're joined today by 2 policy members of Al-Shabaka, Yasmeen El-Khoudary and Tareq Baconi. Thank you so much for joining us. Yasmeen El-Khoudary is an independent London-based researcher and writer who is specialized in Palestinian archaeology and cultural heritage with a focus on Gaza. Prior to moving to the UK, she co-founded Diwan Gaza, an independent cultural initiative based in Gaza. And Tareq Baconi is the Israel-Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group. He served as the US Policy Fellow of Al-Shabaka in 2016 and wrote a book entitled Hamas Contained: The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance. The book was published by Stanford University Press. Thank you so much, Tareq and Yasmeen, for joining us. And let me start with this question. So we'll have 25 minutes to discuss certain questions about Gaza, and then we will open the floor to our audience. So thank you for everyone else joining us, and please feel free to send your questions, and we will then discuss them with Yasmeen and Tareq. So let me start with this question, Tareq and Yasmeen. What's behind the prevailing desperation, both on the ground and in the policy world, and the fatigue among scholars when it comes to Gaza? Why hasn't anything changed, even with the Great March of Return? Maybe we can start with you, Yasmeen, to tell us more about this.
Yes, sure. Hi, Noor. It's good to be part of this, so thank you for inviting me. I think the fatigue on all levels is in part due to the fact that the same arguments have been repeated since day one. People are tired of, and today, 12 years later, everyone is basically tired of repeating the exact same arguments, which had someone actually listened in the beginning, things would have been much different now. But it's sad that the arguments have always been falling on deaf ears. And of course, with Gaza losing the spotlight, and with a lot more conflicts and crises erupting in the region, Gaza has definitely lost its ground, and is no longer a priority for anyone. So if today in this situation, when it's no longer an important issue, no one is actually listening. Can you imagine that anyone who can actually anyone with any influence can actually make a difference. It's not the case. So on the ground, there's a general feeling of hopelessness, helplessness, and also powerlessness. And this to me is definitely a result of 12 long years of a disaster that has just been going from bad to worse. And the absolute fact that nothing on the ground has changed to the better, almost nothing, I say, but sadly nothing has improved for sure. And even with the Great March of Return, people went in thousands to the borders, but many people lost their lives, many people lost were injured, many people were amputated, yet nothing actually changed in these people's lives or on the ground in Gaza. So that, I think, has also added to people's disappointment. And on top of all of that, there's the fact that the double-faced, the double-edged sword of Gaza's, world-famous resilience, the sumud of the people of Gaza, while it's a survival tool, without which we would not have been able to survive for this long. It's also, on the other side, it's also definitely something that has allowed us to continue to adapt to a situation that is unacceptable, that's unbearable, that's inhumane, and for the people of Gaza to always find means to survive, no matter how low or how bad the situation or the conditions get. So this has led to an ongoing trauma in Gaza, a continuous and meaningless trauma and suffering that has basically meant that a lot of people in Gaza actually no longer care, and find that life has very little value. And to me, this is one of the most threatening results of this desperation that's prevailing in the policy world, on the ground, among scholars, among all the parties that you mentioned. It's that the people on the ground have actually completely lost hope, really.
And so, Tareq, so Yasmeen discussed the focus on the people on the ground and the desperation and how they adapted. Can you tell us more about why nothing is changing at the broader political global level, at the level of Hamas, for example, the PA and the international community?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Noor, for inviting me, and thank you for Al-Shabaka for hosting this important discussion. I think it's really crucial that we keep talking about Gaza. And Yasmeen, I completely agree with everything you've said now. The level of desperation is quite heart-wrenching, actually. And so it's important to keep talking about this. And even if it feels like we're hitting our collective heads against a brick wall, we need to keep hitting, because things ultimately need to change. I think, unfortunately, the answer that I have for your question, Noor, is even more depressing. The reason in my mind that nothing is changing in the Gaza Strip is because for all the actors involved, nothing really needs to change. Things are actually quite sustainable as they are, which is a horrific thing to say given the cost in terms of the human life and human suffering of Palestinians living in Gaza. But in terms of the overall structure and the overall dynamics on a policy level and a political level, I don't necessarily see why things need to change. If you look at the benefits that all the main actors, precisely being Israel, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority, the situation as we see it today is quite sustainable. And you can say that not just about Gaza, you can say that about Israel's occupation more broadly of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian territories. But in Gaza specifically, I think from Israel's perspective, the goal here is twofold, really. There's obviously the demographic goal of ensuring that the Gaza Strip remains a separate entity that's isolated from the rest of the Palestinian territories, essentially a goal that allows Israel to maintain its hold on the West Bank and East Jerusalem without necessarily threatening its demographic majority. But more importantly than that, it's a goal of stabilizing the Gaza Strip as an entity that can somehow exist outside of the Palestinian question. So it becomes its own problem to be resolved. So there's that goal, the goal of severing the Gaza Strip from the rest of the Palestinian territories. But then there's also the goal of making sure that the Gaza Strip does not have or does not present a security risk to Israel in terms of, let's say, armed struggle emerging from the Gaza Strip that might impact periphery communities. And in both those goals, having Hamas in power is actually something that allows Israel to achieve that equation. It allows Israel to maintain the blockade on the Gaza Strip because the Gaza Strip is seen as a terrorist haven, it's seen as a terrorist enclave, and therefore it needs to be blockaded and separated. But at the same time, it allows a government like Hamas's government to be in power and to have full security control over the Gaza Strip. And so we have a situation where under Hamas, Israel is able to maintain both of its goals, to maintain the separation of the Gaza Strip under the blockade, but also to maintain some level of security arrangement whereby it enters into indirect ceasefire discussions with Hamas that allow it to reach security arrangements that are frankly workable for Israel. The Gaza Strip today does not present Israel with any real security risk. From Hamas's perspective, what Hamas is getting out of this is that it gets to maintain its control over a quote-unquote liberated territory. So it's able to maintain its presence as a government and as a resistance movement over the Gaza Strip without necessarily providing any kind of real ideological concession to any other Palestinian political party or effectively sharing power. Not because that outcome wasn't possible. There are many local and international outcomes that prevented the kind of unity from happening. But for the time being, Hamas is able to maintain itself as a party that is actually ideologically committed to resistance, that on the face of it at least hasn't made any major concessions and is still the sort of the monopoly holder of the resistance project for the Palestinian Front, overseeing the affairs of 2 million Palestinians. So from Hamas's perspective, even with the financial challenges, even with the political challenges, of which there are many, and we can talk about Hamas in a second, but from Hamas's perspective, the current situation is also preferable to an alternative where the movement collapses and the PA comes back into the Gaza Strip. And for the Palestinian Authority now, I think if you look at the Palestinian leadership today, the idea of taking over the Gaza Strip and managing or being held responsible for the kind of reconstruction that would need to happen for governing the affairs of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza is a nightmare, especially when there is the presence of a party like Hamas that is armed and that has a very sophisticated military wing and that would be able to impact or at least influence the way the Palestinian Authority would come back into Gaza and would be perceived in Gaza. So this is sort of a long way of saying that for the local actors involved, the present dynamic is actually quite sustainable and it doesn't really need to change. And for the international community looking in, what this means is that A, for the actors themselves who are involved, the situation is quite sustainable. But B, when you look at Yemen and you look at Syria and you look at Libya, actually the Gaza Strip isn't a top priority. And this kind of slow strangulation and slow suffocation of Palestinians in Gaza becomes manageable. And so this is a very crude way of looking at the sort of the balance of power and the very cold sort of political calculus that's happening. But in my mind, I think that's why things haven't needed to shift in Gaza. They just haven't needed to.
Okay, so we have a high level of desperation and disenchantment among the people of Gaza, and we also have a situation that is beneficial and sustainable to the different parties and their interests. My question now is, what are the ramifications of this situation? And maybe I can start with you, Yasmeen. So far, what have been the internal political, economic, and social ramifications of this whole situation, and how has the political and socioeconomic structure in Gaza changed in the past 12 years?
I think this requires a very long answer. The political changes in Gaza over the last 12 years have, ranged from everything from how everything started in 2007 with Hamas, elected into into government, how the internal clashes between Hamas and Fatah in Gaza took place in 2007, and how the division between Gaza and the West Bank, between Hamas and Fatah, have obviously led to, it started as a political division, but then has had ramifications on society in Gaza, because, to the extent that families in Gaza are divided between Hamas and Fatah now. It's a very unhealthy division, not just politically, but also on a very social level, on a very intimate level. In a way, you hear stories of siblings fighting over Hamas and Fatah, over who supports who. So the political division, that is to say that the political changes in Gaza are much bigger than just Hamas and Fatah, and are much bigger than the changes that have affected the Palestinian political system per se, or, with the PLC included, obviously, because that is also a big and important factor of the political changes, not just in Gaza but also in the West Bank. But the political changes that have occurred as a result of the situation, I think are, I think they would require a whole discussion. To me, what's the most threatening ramification is the fact that you have an entire generation that was born into the siege, an entire generation that is now at least 12 years old and has never seen a day of electricity, has never been outside Gaza, has never been, is limited to the 40 square kilometers of the Gaza Strip. And to me, that is far more dangerous than any political changes or any economic changes, because, the 2 million people in Gaza as well have had very little opportunities to move or to travel or to get in or out of the Gaza Strip for the last 12 years. And I personally see this as one of the biggest threats on the ground, because the political changes, and like I said, there's a lot of political changes, and there are sadly very unhealthy changes, disastrous changes on all levels, by all means, but they can always be fixed somehow. And it's not exclusive to Gaza. These political changes, they're part and parcel of the bigger Palestinian problem. What I think is much more threatening and immediate and urgent is the ramification, the social ramifications of the siege and of the ongoing situation in Gaza. And of course, because it's such an intimate crisis in a way, everything is very interweaved and connected. So the political has, for example, economic changes, like the demise of the private sector, like the demise of all local industries in Gaza, of fishing, of agriculture. The fact that all of these, all of these industries have completely failed over the last 12 years, also has major social ramifications on people, because 12 years ago, you had people who owned factories, who were, well-to-do businessmen or farmers or fishermen, and now these people are, without a source of income. They rely on UNRWA coupons or NGO, sponsored aid or food parcels, and it's really sad, because it doesn't just mean that people are much more poor than they used to be, or are poor in the first place, but it also means that people's dignity has been affected. And this is linked to another looming crisis another looming crisis in Gaza, which gets very little attention, and that's the fact that there's a major mental health issue in Gaza. There's a major mental health crisis that is basically the result of ongoing military attacks by Israel, the fact that there's absolutely no way you can travel in or out of Gaza. There's very little movement and isolation of the Gaza Strip, and also the fact that people have the people's lives and people's status has drastically changed over these last 12 years. It hasn't been an easy decade. People went from being really well off or really happy or with jobs or just simple things to having absolutely nothing. And look at how many homes were destroyed. Look at how many houses, how many factories. So this is all has been leading to a major mental health crisis, which I think is also part of the fact that this entire generation has been born and raised into an ongoing military siege. And to finish off this point, one thing that I would say is positive, or that has somewhat been able to survive the ongoing disaster in Gaza, is civil society. Because as we saw last year with the Great March of Return, civil society was able to organize something that no political party in Palestine was able to do as effectively and as powerfully. Sadly, with very little results, but it serves to show that civil society in Gaza and in Palestine in general is one of the biggest places, for one of the biggest. One of the biggest players with a lot of potential that definitely deserves more support and attention, and one that can be relied on in the future for, if for any solution. Really, civil society needs to be empowered more and needs to be trusted more in order for any solution to be realized. Really.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmeen. Just a quick reminder to our audience, please send us any questions you have, and we will answer them in about 10 minutes. So, Tareq, building on what Yasmeen just discussed on the internal, especially social effects of this whole situation and the blockade on Gaza, can you highlight the broader implications, the broader political implications of the situation on the Palestinian national movement, Palestinians in the West Bank, etc., just to take a step back and put this within a broader perspective?
Sure, yes. I mean, there's two things that I would like to say here. The first is in terms of the Palestinian national movement, what this has meant for the Palestinian liberation struggle. I think that the situation in the Gaza Strip has absolutely crippled the Palestinian national movement because, the Palestinian leadership has had a legitimacy crisis for years, if not decades, and the PLO is certainly no longer seen as a political institution that is representative of the Palestinian people. Hamas's emergence to political power and its election in 2006 showed very starkly that kind of lack of representation or lack of legitimacy that the PLO has, because Hamas was not within the PLO as an organization that was both democratically elected into the PA, but still removed from the PLO. The kind of crisis that the Palestinian national movement currently suffers under because of the separation between the Gaza Strip and the blockade means that really the Palestinians have no unified voice anymore. And I think this is very much a domestic political problem. I think there are obviously a lot of vested interests from Israel and the international community to try to separate the Palestinians, ensure their fragmentation, ensure that their institutions are left vacuous and unable to be effective. But this is also very much a domestic Palestinian problem. And I think that the situation between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip has really meant that there is no effective Palestinian leadership that is able to speak on behalf of the Palestinians collectively. Both the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, through their failed reconciliation efforts, have shown that they're more interested in their factional interests than they are in the broader national struggle that the Palestinians have to wage, frankly, going forward. And so this kind of separation, this kind of the institutionalization of the separation, not just politically, but socially and in all the ways that Yasmeen eloquently spoke about now, that kind of separation has completely paralyzed the Palestinian political movement, the Palestinian national movement, because it's unclear who the Palestinians are at now, or who they are now, and who's speaking on their behalf. And of course, we need to understand that this isn't something that's new. the Israeli domination of the Palestinian people has from day one fragmented the Palestinians, from the Palestinian diaspora and the refugees to Palestinian citizens of Israel, to Palestinians in East Jerusalem, to the Gaza Strip, to the West Bank. What's different now is that the Palestinian political movement has itself accepted that separation. The PLO now doesn't include Hamas. The Palestinian government and the Palestinian legislature cannot have a consensus government. So now, even in terms of the PLO, even if the PLO were to sort of seek a Palestinian state and speak on behalf of the Palestinians under occupation and the PA to manage the affairs of Palestinians under occupation, even for those, there is no longer a representative government. And so that just, in my mind, is sort of a demonstration of how far the paralysis and the fragmentation of the Palestinian people has gone, and how by the Palestinian acquiescence we've gotten to this level. Again, acknowledging all the sort of external interventions that have played their role. But the second point that I wanted to make on this, which is to carry on from what Yasmeen was talking about in terms of the Great March of Return. I think that the Gaza Strip has always historically played a disproportionate role in resistance, in showing what the future of the Palestinian national movement needs to look like, whether it's from the eruptions of the various intifadas over the years to the way that they now are mobilizing. And I think that the Great March of Return, even though I'm talking about a paralysis and fragmentation on the political level, the Great March of Return, which emerged in the Gaza Strip, is, in my mind, or at least was in its early days, the most representative, pluralistic, civil society-led movement that was talking about issues related to 48, not issues related to 67. Especially in their call of return. And so in that sense, it emerged as a new form of resistance and a new form of mobilization. Now, we can look at how depressing it is on the political level, and we can look at the Great March of Return as a moment of great inspiration. But the reality is that even that moment of full civil society-led, peaceful, popular resistance, even that moment was faced with two things. It was faced with lethal military responses from Israel that were unforgiving and did not make any differences between civilians or combatants or journalists or doctors or whatnot. So the military response was lethal and crushing, but also that the factions themselves, in this case Hamas, were over time fully co-opting of this movement. And obviously we see reminiscences of this or different examples of this happening in the West Bank, in popular resistance emerging in the West Bank that once it's successful gets co-opted by the PA. But the Great March of Return is an example of, in my mind at least, where the future of the Palestinian liberation struggle is moving towards. And I fully agree with Yasmeen that actually the leaders and the factions have, to my mind, failed the Palestinian people, and it's civil society that's still holding on to the struggle. So I think that, for me, Gaza is demonstrating that that's the way forward, but it's also demonstrating what the challenges are in that way. And the challenges are really quite insurmountable in terms of the way that Israel is going to militarize and respond, and obviously that there will be international impunity in its response, even when it results in this kind of war crime activities, but also that our own factions are, and back to the first answer I gave in the first question, are actually quite vested in the status quo, and so are unlikely to want to sort of to accept that kind of popular mobilization.
Thank you so much, Tareq. So one very last question, and very quickly, Yasmeen, building on what Tareq was just talking about, what do you think this means for the future of Gaza and the people in Gaza?
Well, one thing that needs to be said about Gazans is that we Palestinians, Palestinians everywhere, and especially in Gaza, refuse to be passive victims, and that is reflected in the Great March of Return, in people's ongoing resilience. So people will, refuse to give up, and I think just the fact that people are, what I said earlier about adapting and being resilient, that in itself is a way of resisting. because the situation in Gaza is really, really unbearable. And like you said, Noor, in the beginning, it's already uninhabitable. Yet people are still finding means to survive. And that is one thing that keeps me optimistic for the future. So despite all the UN reports, despite all the facts and all the figures and all the warnings and all the threats, I still see hope. I still see that people in Gaza. I think it's that level of desperation that's so alarming that it, gives me some hope, because people are really desperate for a solution. And I think it's in our hands. It's definitely in our hands to lead the way towards that. I echo Tareq again in saying that civil society is the way forward. And I know that young people in Gaza, while many of them, as soon as they get the opportunity to leave, will leave, the others who stay on the ground are trying hard to create opportunities from nothing. So although there's 70% unemployment amongst youth in Gaza, you have vast numbers of young people who come up with crazy entrepreneurial ideas, and people who are really, really creative. So creativity is definitely getting born out of this darkness that Gaza is living in. And although we keep getting faced with disappointments, and although we keep getting a lot of false promises and a lot of false hope, people are always ready to try new methods of resistance, new methods of survival, and really just trying to survive, really. But without an immediate end to the siege, I'm afraid nothing will change. So whatever else is agreed on, whatever political situations are discussed, whatever years of the century we have, if the siege isn't lifted immediately, nothing will change. And I think Gaza, has shown us, has amazed us really with how nothing has changed over 12 years. People have continued to adapt, people have continued to live. The situation has only gotten worse, but nothing else has changed on the ground. So without an immediate end to the siege, and despite anything else that changes in the region, I'm afraid we will continue to see. We will still have this discussion next year or the year after and still be asking the same questions. Why is Gaza stuck in the status quo? We've been asking ourselves this question since day one, like we said in the beginning, and nothing has changed. So without an end to the siege, we will still be asking these questions and probably have the same answers.
Hopefully not. But as you said, without an end to the blockade, it's hard to imagine a move forward or a solution. And speaking of solutions, we have a question by Amjad Iraqi. He's asking, there are increasing efforts to make policymakers recognize the one-state reality on the ground, but this tends to focus exclusively on Israel's absorption of the West Bank while excluding or ignoring Gaza. The question is, how should Gaza be understood in this framing? Is the one-state reality discourse useful or problematic in respect to Gaza? What do you think, Tareq, on this question of the one-state reality and the whole framework when it comes to Gaza? Because I think the question of framing is very, very important.
Absolutely, it's crucial, and I think the one-state reality is really, whether it's problematic or beneficial or however we want to think about it politically, in terms of the reality on the ground, this is the reality. So this is the diagnostic tool that we need to offer to understand any kind of political future. We need to start from the diagnosis of the one-state reality, and it's important to break that term down. So what, for me, the one-state reality means is that we essentially have a single sovereign power in the entirety of the land of historic Palestine, which obviously includes the Gaza Strip. This sovereign power is implementing a regime of control that allows for Jewish supremacy over Palestinian rights. So it's essentially a single regime of control that is enshrining Jewish rights over Palestinian rights collectively in the entirety of this land. Now, this regime of control manifests itself differently in different places. It manifests itself in a certain way in Nazareth, and it manifests itself in completely different ways in Ramallah. But the core of this control, the core of the system of control, is essentially to limit Palestinians in increasingly small geographic areas, while ensuring that Jewish Israelis have access to maximum territory. So it's a process of expanding territorially under Israel's control for Israeli Jews and limiting Palestinian freedom of movement. Now, in my mind, when you understand this idea, the Gaza Strip becomes the most obvious example of the system of control. To my mind, there's really no separation between the Gaza Strip and any Area A within the West Bank. Any Area A within the West Bank is an urban, heavily populated Palestinian area that exists surrounded by Jewish territory, Jewish Israeli territory, and all freedom of movement into and out of that area is under Israeli supervision. And to move in or out of that area, you need permits, and you need to be able to communicate or interact with Kogat, which is the military, which is the civilian arm of the military army in the West Bank. Now that in the Gaza Strip is taken to an extreme, where you have a very heavily populated urban Palestinian area that is completely blockaded from all sides. Obviously, there's a border with Egypt that's kept shut, and that's an international issue with Egypt. But under occupation, it's blockaded from all sides by the occupying force, which is in this case Israel, and is preventing or segregating or ghettoizing, however you want to call it, a certain group of people because of their ethnicity. That system of control exists in the Gaza Strip. It exists in the West Bank as well, and it exists in different softer guises within the Israeli state as it defines itself. It exists in different ways in East Jerusalem, but seeing the Gaza Strip as part and parcel of that one-state reality is crucial. We're not talking about a separate reality here. The one-state reality isn't annexation of the West Bank. It's a system of control that exists over all Palestinian people in the land of historic Palestine. And just to end on this note, it also exists internationally, as in it allows Jews to come back into Israel under the law of return and doesn't allow Palestinians to come back in. So that system of control, that kind of demographic engineering that allows Israel to exist the way it does today, is premised on a system of control that applies differently to the Palestinian people collectively.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tareq. Yasmeen, do you have anything to add on how you think Gaza fits within this whole framework and discourse of one-state reality?
I completely agree with everything that Tareq said, and also just to add that it's the obvious solution for Gaza, because where else do we put the 2 million people? How else do we solve the overpopulation, the density, all the dense refugee camps in Gaza, and the overpopulated?
Your daughter agrees, Yasmeen. Your daughter agrees.
We have the
There you go.
joining her mom.
So yes, I think that also is a really important factor to consider.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a question by Diana, which is related to the question of Amjad, which asks, the question is, can you speak to some of the reasons that Hamas has accepted the idea of a two-state settlement? Maybe Tareq, you can start.
Yes, of course. I mean, it's a very good question. So sorry, Noor?
No, I just said you wrote the book on Hamas, so I think you can have some insights.
So it's a very important question. And, I've now in my new capacity here, I've been doing a lot of research, especially on this one state reality. So I've been talking to a lot of Hamas's leaders about how they deal and how they think about the one state. And it's really interesting. In my mind, the leadership in Hamas has actually followed a very similar evolution to Fatah before it. So for both political parties, I think they believe ideologically, as do many Palestinians, that actually the entirety of this land and dealing with 48 rather than 67 is the only way to really resolve, quote unquote, the conflict. But that the concession of 78% of the Palestinian land is is a major compromise that needs to happen, at least to end the current state that Palestinians are in. And hopefully, and this you will get from PLO leaders and from Fatah leaders as well, that hopefully in the future, who knows what happens? Maybe we will open up borders again. Maybe we will end up in a one-state reality. Maybe it will be a confederation or a binational state. That discourse exists within Hamas, except it exists in a way that refuses to recognize Israel. So it attempts to be, at least on the face of it, ideologically purer. But in reality, Hamas thinks of this in the same way. It thinks of 67 as an interim step, that we need to establish a Palestinian state. We need to concretize all the gain, or all the struggles that we fought for over the course of the past 50 years. We need to get something out of that before we start thinking about the one state. And the reason for them is similar to the reason of the PLO and Fatah leaders. It's simply pragmatism. It's a complete lack of belief that Palestinians can get a one state given the current imbalance of power. They believe, and the quotes that I have in my interviews are quite remarkable. They all agree that the one state is ideologically where they're at, and they all believe that the one state is the most infeasible and naive proposal that any Palestinian could put forward. And it's a very similar discourse that we get from Fatah and PLO leaders. I think it's the belief that Israel will crush the Palestinian movement if we start talking, and Hamas, if they start talking about the one state. So I think that they're trying to both have their cake and eat it too, to say that, we'll take the 67 because this is the more feasible thing, without actually accepting the 67 because ideologically they try to position themselves as having. I think it's very much a game of pragmatism.
Thank you, Tareq. Yasmeen, there's a question from Stephen, which regarding the current state of affairs. The question is, how can we prevent the status quo from allowing Palestine from being ignored to death? What can be done by Palestinians and others to put an end to this cynicism, desperation, etc.?
Well, I think one really important, and this has been done before, and with a lot of success, is for exchange programs to happen. And I'm talking in terms of educational programs, and also in terms of cultural exchange between Gaza and the world. I think young people in Gaza are really desperate for new knowledge, new ideas, and really to see the world. And any chance for young people in Gaza to go out there, to meet people from around the world, to have an exchange of ideas, of knowledge, of culture, of really anything, is absolutely enlightening and very crucial to any solution. And I think that it's these little experiences that can easily be done and organized by people around the world, to host Palestinians from Gaza, to invite them, to bring them out. Of course, travel restrictions will always be a major challenge and obstacle, but wherever they can be combated, seize the opportunity and let people of Gaza visit the world and meet others and speak about their experiences, speak about their lives and about what they've seen, because it's really important, not just for us, not just for people in Gaza, but also for the world to hear. I wouldn't say, if this was a discussion happening maybe 10 years ago, we would have said media, but I think that's out of question today. media has proven to be an obsolete tool, and a very sadly on the other side, completely on the other side, with little subjectivity, with little objectivity. Sorry. So I would say that it's the individual and the small experiences that really matter, and that would have a major impact on both sides. I also think that any awareness that's done in any place, really, there's a lot of really important organizations around the world that do excellent work to raise awareness about the Palestinian cause, and there's a lot of civil movements around the world, and a lot of activism, pro-Palestine activism. That's I mean, these movements have been doing incredible work to raise awareness about the Palestinian cause everywhere, and I think they deserve. They obviously have. We appreciate their work and highly respect it, but they also deserve our support in any way possible. And maybe for in these platforms to try and bring young voices, people to speak about things, not just political issues and discussions around whether it's a 1 or 2 state solution, or how do we end the conflict. I think what really needs to be told is the human stories, the personal stories. I hate the idea of proving that Gazans are humans, but what's really important is for the human stories of Gaza to be heard by the world, and not through traditional media, and not through the conventional platforms and channels. I'm thinking, thinking creative ideas and creative platforms for these voices to be heard.
Thank you so much, Yasmeen. Tareq, there's a question on Hamas and how, following the Syrian revolution and the military coup in Egypt, how is Hamas configuring itself geopolitically?
I mean, that's a really interesting question, because there's been a lot of changes over the course of the past 6 months specifically. I think we saw Hamas's leadership go to Iran about a week ago. So they met with leaders in Iran. I think that the relationship there is starting to turn more positively. I think that's a relationship that Hamas has been looking to safeguard for a very long time. I think it became particularly problematic after 2011, when Hamas took a position against Bashar al-Assad, which essentially severed its ties with both Iran and Hezbollah. And since then, Hamas has been trying to resuscitate that relationship for various reasons, not solely financing and military support within the Gaza Strip and for Hamas's movement, but also in terms of regional politics, aligning Hamas with or allowing Hamas to try to play the regional political map a bit more effectively. So there has been a shift over the course of the past 6 months. It seems like, especially with the changes that are happening within Syria, with the fact that Hezbollah has now withdrawn its forces from, or a lot of its forces from Syria back into Lebanon, and with a greater acceptance and appreciation by regional and international actors that Bashar al-Assad is here to stay for a while. Hamas has now, I think, the kind of conversations that it is having have shifted slightly. So Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah came out in a speech a few days ago saying that Hamas continues to be a very important player and key to the axis of resistance, of course, and from Hezbollah's perspective is seen to be as a fraternal relationship, and that comes at the heel of stronger relations or warmer relations with Iran as well. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can understand and try to analyze those developments. I think they're clearly happening under the shadow of a more threatening confrontation between the US and Iran. And both Hezbollah and Hamas are obviously seen as proxies, as possible groups that could do Iran's bidding in the region and against Israel specifically. I think Hamas, more than Hezbollah, would different leaders would give different answers, of course, but would bristle more at that kind of accusation and would say that they're only focused on the Palestinian cause and that they are Palestinian national movement. But that's the kind of shadow that now the sort of the more global threat of war is posing on the sort of the reinvigorated relation between Iran and Hamas.
Interesting. Thank you, Tareq. There are so many questions on different topics, so that's why there's no clear flow between the questions, but apologies, but I'm just trying to ask the questions that have more votes. So we have a question for Yasmeen from Zaina regarding the health crisis that is alarming Israel with regards to the siege. Can you speak more about it? Although you hinted to the mental health crisis, and Zaina is saying that there is increasing alarm from Israelis about health and sanitation issues in the surrounding land and sea. Do you think this will lead to a shift in the status quo?
I hope so, but I highly doubt. I don't think health is an issue, is a priority when it comes to Israel, especially seeing how the siege has been managed for the last 12 years. We've had much more alarming and urgent health crises over the past 12 years. For example, after or during military assaults on Gaza, the hospitals in Gaza are completely under-equipped. The medicine stores are completely empty. A lot of things are banned from entering Gaza. And during military assaults, you can imagine how alarming the whole situation was, how urgent it was. Ambulances were being attacked, doctors were being shot at. However, it didn't do much to change the situation. There may have been exceptions, and I think this is how Israel deals with the health crisis in Gaza. There's exceptions from time to time, allowing international doctors surgeons to come to Gaza and do operations, maybe allowing some medicine to be entered on an exceptional basis, allowing patients to go from Gaza to the West Bank or Israel, maybe an increase in such numbers. But I don't think the fact that the health crisis is so urgent will lead to any shift on the ground. And it really saddens me to say, but I think it's not a priority for Israel. Like Tareq said earlier, Israel is very happy with the status quo, and there haven't been previous records of Israel changing a political situation just because health is an issue or because education is an issue. These things are secondary or even much lower on the scale than Israel's security and political stability, quote unquote. So I don't think that will lead to any change on the ground. And what health, I think, is another victim of the situation in Gaza that is really difficult to be improved from within Gaza, because there's such limited facilities. Hospitals, like I said earlier, are definitely understaffed. I hear from people I know in Gaza that doctors are leaving Gaza because, one, they don't receive their salaries. Two, they know that the minute they get out of Gaza, there's so many opportunities for them in Germany, in the UK, in France, in Egypt, in Jordan, in the Gulf. So the best doctors of Gaza are actually leaving. So the crisis is definitely getting worse. But will it change anything on the ground? I'm afraid not.
Okay, so based on this, I have a final question, and maybe Tareq, you can answer it regarding what Palestinians can do, because the Palestinian leadership, they submitted a referral to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, claiming that Israeli officials committed war crimes and crimes against humanity against Palestinians. What do you think? Is this enough? And what more can be done by the Palestinian leadership regarding what is specifically happening in Gaza?
I mean, that's so in short, is it enough to go to the ICC? No, I think the ICC is absolutely crucial, and I think that we need to absolutely be putting forward files, whether it's the 2014 assault on Gaza, or the Great March of Return, or a whole host of other files that the ICC is looking to prosecute under, and that is something that the Palestinian leadership, unfortunately, in the past has often that kind of international legal pressure has been suspended in the interest of negotiations, and I think that lesson hopefully has been learned, and that's something that the Palestinian leadership needs to continue pressing on. But what should the Palestinian leadership do? I mean, for me, it's a very cynical moment in time, because I think that the Palestinian leadership, if you think about last summer, and not only did the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank add to the sanctions in the Gaza Strip, but they also ended up cracking down on protesters that were mobilizing in the West Bank in a campaign called Lift the Sanctions, in order to try to increase pressure on the PA to lift the sanctions that the PA was imposing on the Gaza Strip. So not only are we talking about, the leadership not doing anything to alleviate the suffering in the Gaza Strip, we're talking about a leadership that's now complicit in that suffering, and complicit not just to the level of implementing sanctions on Gaza, but on becoming more authoritarian against people in the West Bank who are in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. So if we go back to the point that Yasmeen was talking about earlier, in terms of how the Hamas-Fatah split has gone down to the level of families, we're talking here about a political leadership that's institutionalizing that kind of separation between Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza on every level. So I think as a first step, I think there just needs to be an acknowledgement of the fact that Palestinians in Gaza are Palestinians, regardless of whether Hamas is the ruling party or not, and that the Palestinian leadership needs to deal with the Palestinians there, whether it's Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, in a way that is dealing with the suffering, to alleviate the suffering, whether it's economically or in terms of health, or in terms of education, or in terms of movement where possible, in terms of freedom of speech. And I think that the Palestinian leadership now is certainly not doing any of those things. So regardless of what it's pushing on the ICC front, which are important, I think that actually the main challenge is internally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tareq. Yasmeen, do you have anything to add? Because we don't have time for more questions.
No, I think Tareq answered it beautifully. I don't have anything to add to that specific question.
So thank you so much, Tareq and Yasmeen, for your insights and this enriching, although very sad discussion. Unfortunately, we talked about the very sad, bleak present in Gaza, why nothing has changed, and why we have this desperation and cynicism and fatigue when it comes to Gaza. We also discussed the political, economic, and social effects of the blockade, not only in Gaza, but more broadly on the Palestinian political movement. We talked about Hamas, why it accepted the two-state solution, how we can put Gaza into the one-state solution. And we also talked a little bit about the future, what can be done not only by the international solidarity movements, but also by Palestinians, not only Palestinian leadership, but Palestinians also elsewhere. I think there are so many other questions we should be discussing about Gaza. So hopefully this is not the last policy lab have on Gaza, and hopefully the next one, when we have it, we will be asking different questions. But thank you so much again for the audience for joining us, Tareq and Yasmeen. And please, if you can donate to Al-Shabaka to keep the Policy Lab program going, that would be great. Thank you so much again, and
Thank you.
Good weekend.
Thank you, Yasmeen.
Thanks, Tareq.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Bye.
Bye.